first post-August or post-summer seminar. We're hoping to do a series of these. As many of you know, if you come to Community Energy London meetings, we have a meeting on the last Thursday of every month. My colleague Catherine will provide some details of the next one in the chat column as we go on. But we also wanted to feature a number of webinars on particular topics that have come up during discussions and need a longer time to discuss. Today, we're looking at different local supply models. And we're delighted to have Felix Wright, who will give a introduction to himself very shortly. Uh, Basics, as I said, we're recording today's meeting because we've had several requests. So if you don't want to be like your face shown in the recording, you know what to do. That's the first thing. Secondly, we're scheduled to run to 1 o'clock. We may run slightly over. Not Catherine. Felix has got sufficient time, so we might run till about 1:10, 1:15, depending on how complicated some of the questions will get. Next, we've got several models, microgrids, and so forth that we'll be discussing in today's presentation. And so, every now and again, I'll stop for questions. But if you've got something that comes up to your mind and you'd like to put that in the chat column, I'll be monitoring chats as well to make sure that we can address them as best as we can. Inevitably, I think there'll be some open-ended questions at the end of this, and maybe Felix will be kind enough to kind of get back to one, two of you on a one-to-one basis if there are some specific things you want to pick on. I've just dropped you in it, Felix. For those who don't know me, my name's Said Ahmed. I'm the CEO of Community Energy London. I'm joined here today by Catherine Lindsley, our coordinator, who will provide bits of information about Community Energy London as we go on through the session. But before anything else, I think I'll hand you over to our colleague Felix White, who will give an introduction, and then we'll go through the presentation. As I said, I'll be monitoring things, and Felix, every now and again, I'll interrupt you if I think we probably need a pause or a bit more explanation about one of our exciting diagrams that we'll be showing very shortly. I hope that's okay for everybody. And as I said, we'll probably get more people attending as we go on. But in the meantime, Felix, over to you.
Thanks very much, Syed. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. Yeah, Syed invited me to give this presentation, probably because you couldn't get anyone else to do it, or possibly because I have some experience working across local electricity supply models, specifically for community energy projects over the last sort of 10 years or so, working on more rural projects in Scotland, more urban projects in London, and there have been some recent developments in this space, so it seemed like a good time to catch up. My day job now is working for a company called Connected Response, who make smart controls for electric heating systems as a retrofit solution. But I'm also a non-executive director at Repowering London, and yeah, continue to follow the community energy sector closely. I'm also Repowering London's representative on a working group for one of the proposed regulatory changes that may be coming through later this year, and I'll cover a little bit later on in the presentation. So just bear with me while I hopefully get the slides to share. And I've tried to strike a balance in the level of detail and background information. So I'm sure some of this will be familiar to some people already on the call. Some of it will be new. If people eyes are glazing over, particularly side, then just give me a nudge and I'll kick things on a bit. So I wanted to start with, and this is, I suppose this is quite, it's quite a personal take on local electricity supply. I wouldn't see this as canonical. This is based on my experience, the things that I've found to be doable, difficult, important to think about, can cause confusion. So it's not exhaustive, and other views available, I'm sure we can discuss in the questions. But these are the things that I thought were important in sort of how to think about some of the different models. And I'll be referring to these as I go through talking about the models. I'm not going to kind of define them all now, but thinking about where the infrastructure, the wires that electricity moves along, who owns them? Are they what we call publicly owned? Effectively, they are privately owned because they're owned by private companies, but they're part of the public distribution network. So the wires that connect houses, businesses, and generators across the UK as a whole. Um, or is it parts of the network which aren't owned by one of the licensed distribution network or distribution system operators, in which case it's generally called a private network? Is the metering that is recording what's being generated, being used, is that coming from one physical meter, or is it virtual metering using multiple meters to build up an aggregated picture? We'll talk more about that as well. Are we in a rural or urban context? The different types of networks and the different types of buildings you get have an impact on what supply models may be available. Are we talking about domestic, non-domestic? There's distinctions there as well. And this is a really important one. Um, are the volumes that are being supplied, the volumes of electricity being supplied, do they fall within the licensing regime or not? And next slide to talk about that in more detail. Metering and settlement is an important distinction. Metering is just recording the flow of electricity. Settlement is the process of taking metered volumes, amounts of electricity that have moved or been consumed or been generated, and entering them into the accounting system for the electricity system. So, kind of formally recording them within that system. So you can meter something but not enter it into settlement. And I'll talk more about why that's important in practice. And similarly, the distinction between an M-pan and a meter. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they are different because an M-pan is a meter at point administration number, I think. A meter is a physical object, again, for recording electricity consumption or generation. But the M-pan is the formal address of an endpoint of consumption or generation on the public distribution network. So it's a way of identifying a place on the network. Whereas, and there's usually a meter at that place, but not always. And so yeah, it's distinguishing the thing, which is the meter, from the M-pan, which is the address. Okay. I said I'd talk about license exemptions. And again, I'm not going into lots of detail, but the default position is that the generation, distribution, or supply of electricity is a licensed activity in the UK or GB. But there are exemptions. And some of those exemptions are so well used that we don't even think about them as being exemptions. So anyone here who has or is involved in a generation project below 50 megawatts, you are a license exempt generator, probably, unless anyone's been applying for licenses, you're not obliged to. Um, but yeah, larger scale generation is licensed, and similarly, distribution of electricity is licensed on the public distribution network, and then there's some exemptions if you're using a private network or if you are involved in small scale supply. So, what is small scale supply? Well, it's exemption class D, with an annual maximum supply of 5 megawatts, of which a maximum of 2.5 megawatts can be to domestic customers, uh, defined by capacity rather than volume. So megawatts rather than megawatt hours, which is a bit weird because yeah, how much energy that translates to will depend on the type of generator, if there's a generator involved. But that's how it was written. It was probably written by lawyers rather than engineers. Um, and similarly, there's an exemption class C for supplying volumes of electricity on premises that are owned by the generator, or if you're reselling electricity that's been bought from a licensed supplier. So the reason this distinction is so important is probably um, easiest to show on this slide. If you look at the retail cost of electricity, um, and domestic, non-domestic is similar, but there's slightly higher policy costs on the domestic side. You can see only 35% is the wholesale cost of energy. And then you've got about 20%, um, which is the supplier's operating costs and margins. And then you've got this big chunk, 45%, which relates to network costs, the cost of maintaining the distribution and transmission infrastructure, and environmental and social levies, also called policy costs, which is the government's way of recovering the cost of government policies that might otherwise come from general taxation, but decision was made to recover them specifically from electricity bills, not gas bills generally. So it's quite a big amount because all of the things that you can see here under policy costs, the renewables obligation, the feed-in tariff, contracts for difference, warm homes discount, capacity market, that's all those significant costs are being recovered through a levy on every unit of electricity, every unit of licensed electricity that is consumed. And that's why commercially, as well as legally, the distinction between licensed and license exempt electricity is so significant, because if you are exempt, then you're not exposed to those policy costs. So that's 15% of costs come out of the equation. And generally, although treatment varies in different circumstances, you're probably also not going to be exposed to the distribution, transmission, balancing costs. So that's another 30% that comes out. In a license exempt situation, your costs are essentially the cost of the electricity that you're supplying, which could be zero if you own a generator that is supplying electricity to a customer, and then your operating costs for billing, um, customer service, and depending on the setup, network maintenance or meter installations. I've given a breakdown there. So the distinction between licensed and license exempt is important, but it's not the whole story, because yes, you could technically be license exempt, um, but if you want to interface with other industry parties, there are a whole bunch of acronyms that exist, and you need to find ways of dealing with, and they are designed. Pretty much all of these entities or processes are designed to interface with licensed suppliers and licensed distributors. So if you're license exempt, that can be very difficult in practice, and we'll see that as we go through the models. I've kind of deliberately or lazily left these as the acronyms, just to give you an idea of kind of the alphabet soup it is, and it can be quite difficult to navigate. But you can see the broad categories. There's the metering processes. There's what's called industry flows, which is the commands that are sent to meters and to suppliers and to network operators to tell them how to interact with each other or what a particular entity on the on the licensed part of the electricity system is. The industry codes kind of regulate the interactions between licensed parties. So you've got the balancing, the settlement code, the smart energy code, the retail energy code, connection and use of system code, and distribution connection use of system agreement, I think. Um, and we've talked about the policy cost already. And there's other participants. So there's the people that either own or install meters. There's other suppliers. That whole world, as I've said, is generally defined by uh, licensed relationships, which makes being licensed exempt quite complicated, as we'll see. Okay, so what is local electricity supply? Lots of different definitions out there. The way I think about it is that it's about creating direct relationships between an electricity user and an electricity generator. Um, direct, that could be physically directly connected. It could be there's a direct commercial relationship, but you're not just buying electricity from the wholesale market. Um, and that could be more or less local. That could be electricity that's being generated on the same building, or it could be down the road, or it could be in the same potentially borough um, um, or county. So different models have got different restrictions in terms of how local they can be. But I thought it was useful to start with this drawing. Well, actually, I was going to start with this drawing, but Syed overruled me and insisted on this drawing. Oh, Syed, where's your drawing gone? Uh, okay, just bear with me. I just need to switch to
Are you sharing an
where's
old
the
one?
presentation? Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Hang
Just bear
fire
with
for a
me a
second. I hope
second.
you're keeping up there. We've had multiple presentation issues this morning, but Felix will kind of share the latest one very shortly. I'm hoping this is slowly going through. I'm not seeing the chat column at the moment populated too much, so maybe this is all very straightforward for you at the moment. But the real meat of what we're going to be talking about today is those local supply options that Felix has mentioned about, and some of the kind of challenges that come about as a consequence of doing the point that Felix mentioned, that direct supply relationship between generator and customer. Um,
Yeah, and if there's any questions
yeah,
at this point, then
but
feel free
let's
to chip
saving the hard ones for you, Felix, and when you
in.
get to
Okay,
the meat of
fine.
it. So you want to share your updated one if you've got it now?
Yeah, it is just opening up.
Great, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Syed. Right.
Yeah, it's taking its time. And yeah, it's coming up now, Felix.
Okay. So yeah, I wanted to start with this very basic scenario, which I think most people on this call should be familiar with, which is the most common form of local supply, which is where you've got on-site generation on a building, which has a single point of connection with the grid, like a house. And as I said, while I was very happy with this drawing, Syed insisted on this upgrade. Um, and apparently that is a Porsche in the background. I do not own a Porsche, although, I wouldn't say no. So what this introduces the kind of fundamental elements of pretty much any supply model, local supply model. So you've got the source of generation, solar panels here, and the connection between the solar panels and the MPAN in this case is shown in green. Um, Blue shows a private wire, so all houses effectively are kind of private wire microgrids, or at least on their side of the boundary with the public distribution network, which you can see is shown in that dashed line. And the meter here is red M because it is a meter and an M-pan, where there is a meter within a private wire network. It will be blue to show that it's a sub-meter. And so in this scenario, it's really simple because depending on the commercial arrangements for financing the installation of the solar panels, but assuming that they're owned outright, then sort of by default, generation from the solar panels flows to any consumption that's at the same time within the house. And then any shortfall in demand is met by electricity being imported from the grid, recorded at the meter, and any surplus of generation is recorded here by the same meter as export. And so there's only one commercial relationship, which is with a supplier for that import and export, potentially a second supplier for the export. It is exempt supply taking place under the self-consumption rule. People don't think of themselves as exempt suppliers, but that is sort of legally what is happening in this scenario. And that's why there's such a benefit to having on-site generation, having solar panels on the roof of a house, because you're not exposed to all of those policy costs and network costs that you would otherwise be, at least for the on-site generation. And that's a policy decision, right? If the licensing regime was different, then it could be that there is an additional levy even applied to on-site generation to recover network costs, and that has been part of the ongoing debate, I guess, between the government and Ofgem about how to recover the fixed costs of our electric system while there's increasing amounts of, in this case, behind the meter generation like this. So that kind of sets the terms of reference and is what we're going to build on as we look at the other models. So the next section is really focused on local supply models suitable for houses. Sometimes a house is taken as the default entity or archetype, but of course not everyone lives in houses. But it's simplest, I think, to start with this, and then we'll also look at flats, and then we'll also look at some non-domestic models. Okay, so this would be an example of a private wire microgrid, and you can hopefully see the connection with the previous drawing where we just had one house. So here you've got three houses, but they're all behind the same M-pan. They're all connected to that red M. They also have their own sub-meters in blue. And so the distinction there is that the consumption at the level of the sub-meters won't be visible to the wider electricity system. It won't be visible to a licensed supplier. But what the licensed supplier will see is the consumption at the M-pan meter, the red M. But the sub-meters would allow people who are part of that network to see what their individual property consumption is. And this is not the most common arrangement. The most common arrangement is each property has its own M-pan. But this does happen. It happens sometimes as part of new build developments. They have a single boundary meter, a single boundary M-pan for the whole kind of estate. It also happens in some remote and communities with a long single point of connection to the grid. And it means that the supply options are kind of the same as if you were in with your own house, in that electricity generated here by the solar panels can be sold as long as it's below the supply and distribution thresholds between the houses to each other. As long as they've got the sub-meter as a means for recording the generation and export, they can contract directly with each other. if you've got the billing processes to do that, or a simpler way of doing it is just you would uh, have a bill from your supplier for your total import and any payments from the export, and then you would just split it between the houses if you wanted to keep things simple. And you can build on that model by incorporating a kind of standalone generator, but that's behind the same single MPAN as well. And the numbers here just kind of show how you could keep track of the metered volumes. Um, and you could, in the most simple version, if you had no sub-metering on each house and the wind turbine had generated 20 kilowatt hours, and the net import at the red ampan, you see the -10 below public. If that's -10, then what you know is that there's been 30 kilowatt hours of consumption overall on the private wire network. But you would only know who's consumed what with the sub-meters, and you can see the sub-meter figures add up to 30 kilowatt hours.
Felix, I'll just break in for a second for one question in chat from Odilon. Is there any way to go around an existing MPAN? If, for example, if one house wanted to share power with the neighboring property, so I'm guessing that's kind of private wire between, or even over the public network between house to house.
Well, I guess that will be picked up on the models that we're coming to. But if you wanted to do it just like this,
Hmm.
as a private wire microgrid, then yeah, you could. If your starting point was two houses, on a normal street, and each of them were starting off with individual MPANs, you could put in new cables to connect those houses. You wouldn't be able to use the existing public distribution network. You can't buy the public distribution network, unfortunately. So you'd have to put new cables between the houses, and then there'd be a single point of connection for both houses, a single MPAN, and you'd have to cooperate in terms of how you buy your electricity over that MPAN if there's different owners.
Okay, get the
So
idea. Yeah,
yeah, can be done,
can be done.
not very common.
Yeah,
Um,
you continue, Felix.
So yeah, this model is very doable if you have a new build situation, and there are some people who have retrofitted private wire microgrids like this as well. There's I can think of Findhorn near Inverness, which is a kind of intentional community, and they have their own private wire microgrid that works just like this, but harder to implement in a retrofit scenario in your average London terrace street. Um, and again, this is why. So this is the same drawing, um, pretty much, but without the private wire infrastructure. Here, it's just showing the public distribution network that is connecting the houses and the generator. And the interesting thing is that from the point of view of license exemptions, you could, in theory, do license exempt supply in this situation if your generation was below the threshold, and you're below the 2.5 megawatts of domestic demand. So yeah, I mean, you could just, generator could contract with number 23 and sell them electricity, and they wouldn't have to be licensed to do that. But what they would come up against is the practical problems that I mentioned earlier of all the other industry interfaces. So how would that generator tell the house, this is how much electricity I have generated and you've used? And how would the house pay the distribution charges associated with that? Because they would be using part of the distribution network to transport it. So those are the complexities. It's not just a question of the licensing, it's also a question of the industry interfaces And as I've said, that's hard to do when you're license exempt. So a proposal for dealing with this sort of situation um, that is in progress is called BSc modification P441. It's been put forward, it's been led by somebody called Mary Gilly, who set up Energy Local, and it's been put forward by Green Energy UK on their behalf because BSc mods by default need to be submitted by a BSc party. So it's an interesting thing about the governance. It's the licensed entities that shape the governance of the electricity system. So that obviously has a bearing on what things get approved and what doesn't. As you can see, it's been quite a long process on P441, 3 years so far and not finished yet. A consultation expected later this year, but there has been progress in that what the modification is designed to do is to kind of clarify what network charges is and balancing costs are payable in a scenario where you are aggregating metered consumption to create specific local supply arrangements. And the next diagram will illustrate that more clearly than these words. Um, uh, but the minded to position is essentially supportive. This is something that is happening already. There are existing energy local clubs doing this, and it's based on an interpretation of the Balancing and Settlement Code. And so P441 is to sort of put that interpretation on a more standardized footing where everyone's in agreement on the treatment and the circumstances where it can be used. And the hope is that if this is approved, then more suppliers will have more licensed suppliers will have the confidence to support these sorts of arrangements because the model requires a sort of partnership relationship between a license exempt supplier and a licensed supplier. So if we go on to the next slide, you can see how it works. So for simplicity, I've just grouped all of the, the customers who are part of what I've called the virtual meter. The Energy Local terminology is an Energy Local club. Other people call them virtual microgrids. But essentially, you're drawing a kind of an imaginary line around some specific points of demand and generation. That line does not have to be, well, it's specific to each point of demand. So it wouldn't be that sort of a whole village, or indeed, as we'll see later, a whole block of flats needs to be included. It can be selective. So you could have one house in and the neighbor not. And it's all done on an opt-in basis. So it's an active choice to become part of the virtual meter. And then that allows the generation and demand to be combined as if they were a single entity, as if they were, in the scenario we saw before, a physical microgrid with a single boundary meter. So rather than having a physical boundary meter, there is a virtual boundary meter. And the data from that virtual boundary meter can be used in the same way to calculate the amount of additional imported electricity required from a licensed supplier and the amount of surplus export to be sold to a licensed supplier. And I've included the numbers here because you can see I've used the same numbers, so you can see that you can calculate that net position without having an additional meter just by the individual meter values at each property. So the overall import here is still minus 10 kilowatt hours as in the previous example, but that's inferred from the individual metered values at each point of demand and at the generation. And so the beauty of this model is that it allows license exempt supply to take place over the public distribution network because um, uh, it's possible to account for what has been moved where. And it still allows for payment of the appropriate network charges. So the distribution costs are still there because the distribution network is still being used. The transmission network costs are effectively reduced because demonstrably the transmission network is not being used for the transport of these specific units. And there's a wider philosophical debate around whether there should still be some sort of contribution to the transmission network cost. And that's really what the P441 process has been about and taking a final decision on. Um, the licensed exempt supply, the entity that Energy Local uses for that is a cooperative, but could be any sort of entity that is capable of entering into contracts, and then the license exempt entity works in partnership with a licensed supplier who can provide billing services, and also provides the top up electricity. Because depending on the type of generator involved, I've shown a wind turbine here, but if it was solar, there'd be quite a lot of top up taking place in the winter when the solar output is lower.
Just on that top up a bit, we've got a question from Zach of Energy for All saying, would the import bit, the licensed import element, need to be arranged communally at the virtual meter, or would those individual users have their own electricity supply contract?
Yeah, so in this model, each um, participating point of demand, club member, still has their own MPAN, not just meter, but MPAN, and they have their own relationship with a licensed supplier.
Mhm.
But it is the same licensed supplier for all of the club members. And part of what Energy Local does, other organisations could do it as well, is um, do the calculations of who've used what, pass that information to the license supplier, who then, at least how they're doing at the moment, provides the bills. So if you were in one of these clubs, you would receive a bill from your supplier, probably Octopus Energy at the moment, or UK Green Energy, and you'd see this month you've used 30 kilowatt hours, and 10 kilowatt hours of those were from local generation, and whatever the tariff that's been agreed for that, and 20 kilowatt hours were from the grid. And yeah, the pricing of the local generation is agreed between the generator and the um, demand customers. So it's not it's not set by the wholesale price necessarily. It might refer to the wholesale price, but it's a direct agreement between them.
Okay, so just
Um,
building upon that, one, there's only a number of suppliers that will probably enter into this relationship with you, and two, at the outset of the club, you will need to decide upon which supplier takes that kind of communal contract. Well, that contract with
yeah,
individual homes across the community.
that's right. Yeah, there'd be one supplier appointed for
Okay,
the virtual meter. Yeah.
all right. Zach's given us a thumbs up. Carry on.
Okay. So some supply models for flats. Back to my lovely drawings. So I didn't manage to winkle these out in time. But yeah, the arrangements in flats is a bit different because you're within one building, and the default option that you have for houses um, doesn't work in quite the same way. If you have a communal solar installation, generally, if that's got kind of one inverter, it would be connected to the landlord meter for the block, for the communal areas, rather than to each individual flat. Um, but it is actually possible to connect to each individual flat. It just requires more infrastructure, or other operating models that I'll go on to. But in this example, which I've called solar splitting, effectively it's another microgrid, but here the solar is being either statically by having lots of individual inverters, or dynamically by having something like the Soul Share system, split into discrete units of power that are then connected behind the MPAN for each flat, because in this scenario, and it's the most common arrangement, each flat does have its own MPAN. And then it works kind of the same as if you're in a house with solar panels on the roof, in that you have your allocation of solar. That is where your electricity will come from when you're using electricity and solar is generated. Otherwise, it will come from your grid input through your own MPAN. So it doesn't. The only supply relationship that changes is if you need to pay for the solar electricity used, in which case you'll have some sort of billing arrangement for that with the landlord or the owner of the solar panels. Um, and in a flats context, one of the advantages of this model is that from an EPC point of view, the solar will benefit your individual flat, and which doesn't normally happen with communal solar installations on flats. Um, Downsides are the cost of the additional infrastructure, the connections, or the hardware compared to a standard solar installation. Um, and if, yeah, depending on the meter, where the meters are, it can be quite fiddly to run the connections to the meters. Um, and then with any physical infrastructure that's privately owned, you've got some ongoing maintenance costs and liabilities. So not such a problem in new build. It's all designed in, but if you're trying to retrofit, this can be tricky.
Hang fire for 1 second. I'm just going to take you back to one of the models beforehand, which I apologize for because I'm probably disturbing your flow on this. But just a quick question from Paul Hallis about on the club model. Um,
Mhm.
if there were individual buildings belonging to, say, a single academy trust, so could you, Paul's asking, could there be an ability for trust buildings within that same academy supplying surplus power from one site to the other?
Yeah, so in this scenario, each academy has its own MPAN, so they're not all on the same site. Then yeah, you could use this model. The sort of geographic limit on this model is that the generation and demand need to be behind the same um, primary substation, um, which is the point of connection between the distribution network and the transmission network. So what that means in practice varies. Sometimes that will be quite a big area, sometimes it'll be quite a small area. But in principle, yes, um, this model can work for both domestic and non-domestic.
So there's a physical limitation you said about the substation in
Yeah.
terms of the ability of sending it over the network. And is the substation the same as a grid supply point, or are they different?
Um, the substation is the next level down from
Oh,
the
so
grid.
even smaller.
Yeah.
So in practice, there have to be two academy schools pretty near one another.
Yeah, I mean, depends on where you are in the country, but in London, yeah, they'd be need to be fairly close.
Okay, Paul, I hope that goes some way answering your question. I think there's some caveats there, but Felix, back to the flats. Anna,
That's
you've
okay.
got your camera on. Did you want to answer a question? No, fine. Felix, rock on.
Okay, so this is another flat specific model. The difference here, I mean, it's sort of if you thought about the microgrid example we showed earlier with the three houses, this is that, but within a block of flats. So you've got a single boundary MPAN for the whole block, and then each flat has a submeter, and you just connect the generation and um, all your flats behind the same single meter. This is how some flats are already set up. Um, um, so it can be, quite straightforward in that situation. If you're trying to convert a flat that looks like this to one that looks like this, then you're going to have to change the meters and change the flat level meters and also the boundary meter, and probably do some changes to the internal wiring to support that. Um, a recent change that I'll come on to is the ease of using sub-meter data for settlement. And if you were listening, that kind of contradicts something I said earlier, where it was only MPAN meter data that could be used for settlement. But the recent change is to allow sub-meter data to be used for settlement as well, which will make it a bit easier to set up these arrangements without everyone having to opt in. That has been the barrier. And what I've shown here is that for everyone to be behind that boundary meter, then everyone needs to say, yeah, we're happy with that arrangement. And as anyone who's worked in community engagement and trying to get everyone in one place to agree something can be quite challenging. But that's become a bit easier with this change that would allow um, sub-metered data to effectively to allow people to keep their existing supplier if they didn't want to be part of the communal scheme. That's the sort of practical effect of it. And yeah, billing arrangements could be a single bill. So whoever is responsible for the electricity consumption at the MPAN will be recovering that cost from or making payments to the people behind it. Yeah, it could be a single bill, or you could separate out the elements. And this is a model that is being done already. And there's a specialist supplier looking to roll it out called Emergent Energy. And I'll just come back. Well, it's probably as well to cover it now. So Emergent Energy developed this BSC modification P455, which was, yeah, this change about the treatment of sub-meters on private wire networks, and is applicable to both domestic and non-domestic. So if this wasn't a block of flats, but a business estate that was also supplied by a single MPAN, then this modification will make it easier to treat that business estate as a microgrid with a single on-site generation, while allowing people to appoint their own licensed supplier if they want to.
Felix, and just you we're having a really good time, but we're actually at 12:50. But
Yeah,
not a problem. I did mention to people, and I'll just mention it again. We've got the ability to run over a little bit, but just letting you know, just in case there are
hurry
certain
up a bit.
press more
Yeah,
than others.
I'm
Go ahead.
not too far off.
That's
So
fine.
this really is, we've covered it already. This is the virtual meter model, but just in a flats context. So it could be two neighboring blocks. It could be um, a single block with solar panels on the roof. But again, it's this way of drawing a virtual boundary around your participating demand customers and bringing them to a set of common arrangements for receiving the local generation, um, while retaining their own existing meter. It does have to be a SMETS 1 or 2 smart meter. Um, and okay, let's look briefly at non-domestic models. It's kind of simpler. Again, this was my drawing of a boot factory. Syed refused to accept it. So this is what we're referring to. And it's all much the same. So this is the kind of the on-site scenario, or pretty much on-site scenario. In a London context, this could be a warehouse with a big solar installation, or a train depot, neighbouring a school. And what you do is bring that generation, give it its own point of connection to the school, and then they'd be both behind the same MPAN. And if the generation is owned by somebody else, then they can just have a direct power purchase agreement with the school, or if the school owns it, then it just reduces how much electricity they have to buy in from the grid. So that's pretty straightforward. What if the generation's further away? Well, you can put in a longer cable up to a point. The cost of putting cables in increases over distance. So what if you have this situation? The generation is not directly connected to the factory, um, but they are on the same bit of distribution network. So there is a code change that has come in specifically for this scenario. And so it would also relate to the question earlier about the academies, and this is called P442. And this is started at the same sort of time as P441, but it is actually now implemented. But it works slightly differently. It creates a mechanism for exempt supply to recover the costs that it shouldn't have been charged when it's been treated as licensed supply. So in this example, if power was being sold from the wind turbine to the factory with a licensed supplier making that arrangement through a what's usually called a sleeved PPA, using the public distribution network, the factory would have to pay the network and policy costs associated with that generation because they're receiving it from a licensed supplier. What P442 does is say, well, yeah, it's being transported by a licensed supplier, but it isn't actually licensed supply because the generation's below the supply exemption thresholds. So we need some way of getting that money back. So it's a kind of a credit mechanism. It doesn't, the difference with P441 is that the supply is treated as sort of licensed and then you get a discount on it. Whereas in P441, the licensed supply and the license exempt supply are kept separate and metered separately. This is a model that people who provide these sorts of PPAs are offering now. It's non-domestic only, so far anyway. I think that's because of some of the administrative costs involved in kind of applying these credits. But going back to the cost breakdown that we saw earlier, it's probably something like a 30% discount that you would get through recovering the policy and maybe some of the network costs under this model. My concern about this model is that it has no local element. So you could use this mechanism to recover costs from generation that's in Land's End, that's notionally supplying demand in John O'Groats. And that just seems a bit weird because it is going to be using the infrastructure between those two places. And it's not really providing a system benefit. The system benefit from Energy Local, P441, is that you're creating incentives to match generation and demand at a local level. And balancing generation demand at a local level on every half hour creates wider system benefits. You don't have to reinforce the transmission infrastructure as much as you might otherwise have to bring energy into somewhere because they're already meeting their requirements locally. So P442 doesn't create those incentives. It could be part of the commercial agreement, but it's not part of the code change itself. So while lots of people are piling into this, remains to be seen how long it lasts. And one of the things I've heard is that if P441 goes through, then it will probably supersede P442 because it provides a sort of more targeted way of achieving a similar outcome. Okay, things to think about when looking at these different models. As hopefully, I've emphasized, it's not just about whether something is exempt or not exempt. You've also got to think about the operating costs. Sometimes that will be very, very low for a very simple on-site microgrid. Sometimes it will be quite high where you've got more complicated microgrids and more extensive infrastructure. Where are you going to get your customers from? will they sign up? You think they'll sign up, but will they? How much resources is it going to take to get that? If you are taking ownership or building new physical infrastructure, that's got ongoing maintenance costs. If you are replacing meters, there's meter costs, meter reading costs that need to be considered. You're still going to be exposed to wholesale costs. So when you're doing your modeling, how much of the benefit comes from the access to the local electricity, where presumably you've got some more control over the price, and what proportion of your annual demand will that cover? So it might be really great for the 10% of local solar electricity you can use, but if you've still got the same cost for the 90% of demand, and you've got additional costs for setting up the arrangements required for the 10%, is it worth it overall? Um, and a big one is, will there be changes to your exempt supply exemptions, which is always a possibility. If an increasing number of people manage to avoid making contribution to the policy costs and network costs, Ofgem and the government will probably look more closely about how to recover those costs elsewhere. And likewise, there could be further changes to the BSC. So those are particular considerations if you're looking to build new generation based on one of these models. So where are the main opportunities? I would say looking at
I'm going to interrupt you again just very quickly. But then again, I've got a feeling, is this your last slide or something?
it is, yeah.
Yeah, you crack on then. I'll bring these two questions in the chat column afterwards.
So adding value to existing installations where there's less risk, if you've got fallback arrangements that you can continue to use if you need to. Looking at new build developments, particularly for physical microgrids, if you design it as a microgrid from the start, it's very marginal additional cost, but potentially good ongoing reductions in running costs. P442 is available, and there are a number of different people providing it as part of their PPA options. I've listed some of them there. I'm sure there's more. And yeah, this forthcoming consultation on P441, I really think it is a model that strikes a good balance between enabling these direct relationships between generation and demand while maintaining consumer protection through the involvement of a licensed supplier, while making a fair contribution to the network costs. That's kind of proportional to the cost and benefits of the arrangements. And I think it could be a game changer for the community energy sector if it goes through and more licensed suppliers agree to support it, because at the moment only Octopus and UK Green Energy are supporting it on a very limited basis. You can't just sign up anywhere. So I'm sure Cell will be drawing attention to that consultation when it is finally released.
Can't wait.
Yeah, that's everything, Syed. So happy to pick up any more
Thank
questions.
you. So apologies to those who've got to run away at 1 o'clock. We're going to run for about another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll draw a close to the session. So we've got Omar asking, not a stupid question at all, Omar, because I was just thinking about it. Omar was asking, uh, we're talking about local supply models. Are they the same thing as peer-to-peer, or are they different? So it's actually a good question.
Yeah, I'd say peer-to-peer is a sort of a subset of
Yeah.
of local supply. So um, peer-to-peer is where you've got multiple generators and multiple points of demand, and they're falling within some sort of arrangement that allows them to contract directly with each other or via a local market. But there will need to be, if it is local peer-to-peer, there will need to be some sort of local supply arrangement to enable that, unless it's a kind of pretend peer-to-peer arrangement where it's described as peer-to-peer, but it's not actually doing anything differently in terms of how the network costs, policy costs, or supply costs are calculated.
Just one thing you didn't touch upon, Felix, of course, is there are certain allowances on continental Europe on local supply from a community generator, correct? Can you just talk about that for a minute before I get to the rest of the questions?
Yeah, so I think it's called, well, they call it collective self-consumption rather than local supply. Um, there is a European mandate for it. Different countries have interpreted it slightly differently. And in some of those versions, it is a geographic distance between generation and demand, and some of them it is a maximum capacity. Um, so a bit like our supply exemptions. So I think the reason we don't have the equivalent yet in the UK is that yeah, we haven't fallen within that. I think if P441 goes through, that will probably become the sort of nearest equivalent
Yeah,
to that sort of directive.
that's my understanding. Quick point of information here from Jess Dunning. Thanks for this, Jess. Jess has written, for your information, we were advised by Cornwall Insight that as now P442 is codified, it's unlikely to be removed. So I don't know whether or not you said it's going to be removed or not, but anyway, Jess is saying it's unlikely to be removed, particularly as it's formalizing an existing process. However, the definition of a license exempt supplier could change, such as by placing a hard limit on generator size or exempt volumes.
Yeah, I mean, um, it's other people I've spoken to have said that P442 could be superseded. It would, of course, require a code change, but that could happen. The other route, it would be, yeah, changing the license exemption regime. Um, I think it really depends on what the scale of its impact is, and if P441 does go through, then there are more, effectively more safeguards in place than there are for P442.
Okay.
But yeah, I would just say never
Well, I
in this
just
space.
reminding people that 442 is the number of the modification, which says there have been 441 modifications before it. So there are an awful lot of modifications throughout this process, and they will continue. Dave Green asks, what sort of benefits or kilowatt hour benefits as well are available under P441, and how might they be split? So what are the benefits that P441 might deliver to, I guess, the end consumer, and how would they be split?
So it basically enables exempt supply between the generator and the demand, so they can choose their price, and that price won't include the policy costs, and it will include a reduced amount of network costs. In a nutshell, so if the retail price is 25p, you could have a local tariff for that match generation, kind of any number you want that you're willing to agree to, but sort of 8 pence a unit wouldn't be unrealistic, probably. There would be benefit to the generator, and that would be a significant saving for the demand customers as well.
And just one thing. So if loads of people do take advantage of this, less policy costs are recouped by the suppliers to give back to government. So what's happening overall to the policy cost pot?
Yeah, well, that's why there's a risk of the current position changing. Um, I think the license exemption regime cuts across, not just local supply models. Um, it's a broader piece of legislation, so it doesn't just affect any individual model, and I wouldn't say any individual model is exploiting the rules. They just are the rules.
They are the rules.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think in the case of P441, there's been this specific consideration of the network costs and what a fair allocation of those is. But yes, and the idea is that this local balancing is providing a wider system level benefit, and so it's proportionate. In the case of policy costs, as exempt supply increases, as things stand, the remaining policy cost will be still be recovered from the remaining license volumes.
Okay. James from Jojo said, very good explanation, Felix, but it's still very complicated. I second that. I have a feeling the system will still be in the hands of a small number of suppliers like now. Well, we've actually got quite a lot of suppliers. Well, we had a lot of suppliers. It's gone down again, isn't it? But we can't take away from the fact that it is extremely complicated. So, where do you think community energy groups can best take advantage of this, Felix?
Where do I think community energy groups can best take advantage of this?
Hmm.
Well, I mean, it depends on the circumstances. I'm afraid. It's like, um, I think, the emergent model for blocks of flats is out there now. There's some, and likewise, Soul Share. They're probably the most accessible if you're kind of starting today. But I think P441 is the one that's going to open up the kind of the widest range of opportunities in different circumstances. And then in community groups working with developers, housing providers, then they should definitely be thinking about the private wire microgrid as part of those plans.
Toby's asked, in the P442 model, which components are rebated? Jess has kindly provided a bit of an answer here, so I'll just repeat back what Jess has said. So again, Toby's saying which bits are rebated from the P442 model. Jess has said there is a reduction in the CFDs, the contracts for differences, and CM, which I think means capacity market levies, for the exempt matched volumes on the supplier. The
Yeah.
amount rebated then depends on how much was matched with the levy value. Oh, sorry, what the levy value is in that half hour. Something not changed and then passed, and then the amount is passed on by the supplier. I think I need to
Yeah.
read that a couple more times, but yeah, nothing to add to that.
No, no, thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Jess, for that. Yep. Omar, are there opportunities for adding battery storage to these supply models?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it will just make it easier to uh, have your self-consumption. So it will increase your self-consumption depending on how the battery is configured. There's other ways of using batteries to create savings by when you buy the grid electricity and potentially providing flexibility services. But in the first instance, it will make it easier to kind of capture the on-site or local generation when it's available. Um, so far, my experience, it's kind of small scale batteries. It's been hard to make the business case work so that the value they create, it isn't kind of fully covering their costs. But I wouldn't see that as definitive. I would just say um, the benefit needs to be assessed carefully. But hopefully, with battery costs reducing and more batteries available at a sort of commercial communal scale rather than just domestic or grid scale, then they will play an increasingly important role.
Okay, and the last comment here, which again Jess has very kindly responded to, which I can recognise, Paul Hallis was saying, why is P441 basically running behind P442? And Jess's answer said, well, P441 is more complicated, put more complicated and provides more change. P442 was formalising and providing a longer term solution to a practice that was already in place. Broadly agree with that, Felix?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm on
just
the
the way it
P441
works.
group, so it's kind of, there's not something, yeah, some things I can't go into, but um, these mods are always difficult, and I'd say the more interests that are the more change, the more interest that are particularly potentially affected, and the kind of more pushback you can get. But I think it's in a pretty positive place now. Just waiting for the consultation to get going.
Okay, and on that note, always good to leave people with bait in their breath for another consultation. This time, not from the government, but from Elexon. Okay, Felix, that was a real tour de force of running through what is a extremely complicated issue, and always nice to have loads of acronyms, I feel. that kind of a sure sign that we've done a good job of delivering a good set webinar when we've got lots of acronyms referenced through the talk. Um, Felix, are you happy to take any kind of bilateral emails that people might
Yeah, yeah.
send to
I
you?
put my connect response email address at the top of the slides. They'll be circulated, maybe with some slight changes to the drawing side. I don't know.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, your
so
weird boot factory, which we didn't go on to, was I thought particularly strange. But anyway, we'll leave it there. Everybody, thank you very much for coming along today. I hope that provided and cast a bit more light on what is a complicated issue. I always remember going into a room once, I can't remember which organization it was, and looking at the electricity code. And it was printed out in the good old days, and it took up a whole wall of something about 32 files of A4, massive lever files, and that's just one of the codes. And Felix mentioned several in there. So this is not a trivial market to try and enter into. And the big suppliers, as James has said, definitely don't make it easy as well. The last meeting I went to when some of this was discussed, only one person in the room seemed to know what was going on, and he was a lawyer who'd been on the case for about 20 years. So this is quite fearsome stuff, but I think the direction of travel really is an awful lot with decentralized generation, and also in terms of realizing the value of local supply, which I think is particularly important for London, which is why we're covering it here. We've gone over time. Forgive me all. We've had a number of dropouts, but I hope that was useful. As I mentioned, we will be putting Felix's presentation and a recording on Sal's website, communityenergy.london, in the next day or so. Catherine will be arranging that. We've got our monthly meeting at the end of the month, Thursday the 25th, from 6 to 8 p.m., which will include a presentation by the GLA about what we hope will be launched at the end of the month or the beginning of next month, the eighth round of the London Community Energy Fund, which is tremendously exciting. We've been working on that quite actively with London colleagues for quite some time now. It just leaves me to say thank you for attending today. Felix, thank you for all your hard work in actually pulling this all together. Super helpful, and we may well return to this probably in the next few months or so, maybe as P441 kind of matures and goes through the consultation process. So thank you again, all, and we'll be catching you up in a Community Energy London event very soon. Cheers, all.
thanks, Side. Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone.
Felix. Bye.